November the 5th, 1995. A camera crew pulls up to the gates of Kensington Palace. They tell the staff they're there to install a hi-fi system. They're waved through. Equipment is carried in. And 15 days later, 23 million British people sit down in front of their televisions and watch the most explosive royal interview ever recorded. The national grid logs a 1,000-megawatt power surge as the entire country switches on at once. 200 million people worldwide will eventually see it. Princess Diana, in her own words, dismantled the House of Windsor from the inside. 3 of us in this marriage, queen of people's hearts. It is television history. But here is what those 23 million people did not know. Every single thing that got that camera crew through the palace door was a lie. A deliberate, documented, judicially confirmed lie. And the man who told it would not be exposed for 25 years. If this is your first time here, welcome to Jenny Exposes. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and turn on your notifications because we do not do gossip here. We do documents. We do judicial reports. We do the truth that the establishment spent decades trying to bury. Now let's get into it. To understand what Bashir did to Princess Diana, you have to understand who Diana was in the autumn of 1995. She was 34 years old. She had been separated from Prince Charles for 3 years. The marriage, by that point, was not a marriage in any meaningful sense. It was a PR arrangement, held together by press officers and palace protocol. She had already spoken to Andrew Morton for his 1992 biography, those secret recordings made in the basement of Kensington Palace, Diana whispering her truth onto cassette tapes that she handed to a journalist because no one inside the institution would protect her. By 1995, the gloves were already partially off. But Diana had not yet looked directly into a camera and said it all herself. She was living inside Kensington Palace, and if you think that sounds glamorous, understand what it actually meant. She was inside the machine that was trying to manage her. She was surrounded by staff, some loyal, some reporting elsewhere. She genuinely believed she was being watched, followed, and that people in her orbit were being paid for information about her. Now, some of that paranoia was real, grounded in genuine experience of how the palace operated. But some of it was manufactured. And that distinction is everything. Here is where Martin Bashir enters. Bashir was a relatively unknown BBC journalist in 1995. He was not a household name. He was ambitious, and he wanted Diana. Not in the way the tabloids wanted her, for pictures outside a gym or caught crying at a charity event. He wanted the interview, the defining get of a generation. And he knew that getting to Diana directly was almost impossible. She was insulated. So he went through the side door. He went through her brother. Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, Diana's only sibling, was the key. And in September of 1995, Bashir arranged to meet Spencer at his estate in Althorpe. This is where it begins. This is the moment where the entire edifice of deceit is constructed. Because Bashir did not come to that meeting empty-handed. He came with documents. Bank statements, to be precise. Statements that appeared to show that Spencer's former head of security, a man called Alan Waller, had been receiving payments. From News International, the publisher of The Sun. And from an offshore company. The clear implication being that Waller had been paid to spy on Princess Diana. Charles Spencer looked at those bank statements, and he was alarmed. He was protective of his sister. He genuinely believed she was being surveilled, as many around her did. And here was a journalist with what appeared to be documentary proof. So Spencer did what any protective brother might do. He arranged a meeting. He introduced Bashir to Diana. Those bank statements were fake. That is not a claim. That is not a tabloid assertion. That is the formal finding of a judicial inquiry conducted by Lord Dyson, a former justice of the UK Supreme Court, in a 127-page report published on the 20th of May, 2021. Lord Dyson found, beyond any doubt, that Martin Bashir had commissioned those forged documents from a BBC graphic designer named Matt Weisler. Weisler was asked to create fake bank statements. He did. Bashir used them, and the BBC, as an institution, would spend the next 25 years pretending none of it had happened. Think about what those forgeries actually did. They did not just trick Charles Spencer into making an introduction. They did something far more insidious. They activated Diana's deepest, most raw fear. The fear that the people closest to her were being paid to betray her. That fear already existed. Diana had experienced real betrayal. She had reason to be cautious. But what Bashir's forgeries did was take that legitimate caution and weaponize it. They convinced her that the threat was everywhere, that even her most trusted staff were on someone else's payroll. Once she believed that, there was only one person who had allegedly exposed it. One person she could trust. Martin Bashir. That is not journalism. That is psychological manipulation. It is the construction of dependency through manufactured fear. And it worked perfectly. Rosa Monckton was one of Diana's closest friends. She gave testimony that was cited directly in Lord Dyson's report. And what she described was a transformation. Before Diana met Bashir, she said, their friendship involved the normal things, the day-to-day matters, the kind of conversations any two friends have. After Diana met Bashir, Monckton said, everything changed. Diana became, in her words, obsessed with plots against her. Not casually worried, obsessed. Andrew Morton, the biographer who had already spent years speaking with Diana in depth, told the inquiry that Bashir had, in his words, scared her half to death with stories of MI5 surveillance. Morton was not an inexperienced observer. He had sat with Diana through some of the most vulnerable conversations of her life. And his assessment was that Bashir had taken her existing anxieties and amplified them deliberately and relentlessly. By the time the camera crew arrived at Kensington Palace on the 5th of November 1995, Diana was primed. She had been brought to a state where she trusted Bashir implicitly, because Bashir had made himself the person who had seen the evidence, who had come to her, who had warned her. The interview that followed was real. Her words were genuine. When she said there were 3 of us in this marriage, she meant it. When she said she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts, she meant it. Nobody puts words in Diana's mouth. But the conditions under which she spoke, the emotional state she was in, the level of trust she had placed in the man sitting opposite her, that was engineered. The broadcast on the 20th of November 1995 was an event. 22.8 million UK viewers, the largest documentary audience in BBC history at that point. The national grid surge is a real, documented figure. The whole country stopped. Diana's words hit like a detonation. The marriage was finished in the public imagination. The palace was in crisis. And Martin Bashir became, overnight, the most talked-about journalist in Britain. Here is the part where it gets darker still. Because it did not take 25 years for someone at the BBC to know the truth. It took 6 months. In April of 1996, Matt Weisler, the graphic designer who had actually created the forged bank statements, raised formal concerns with the BBC. He was troubled by what he had participated in, he told his superiors. A complaint was logged. The BBC opened an internal inquiry. And here is the name you need to know. The inquiry was led by Tony Hall. At the time, the BBC's head of news. Later, Director General of the BBC. Later still, Baron Hall of Birkenhead. The man who would go on to run British public broadcasting at the highest level. Tony Hall interviewed Martin Bashir. Bashir denied everything. Hall concluded, in writing, that Bashir was, quote, an honest and honourable man. The inquiry found nothing. The complaint went nowhere. Weisler, who had raised the alarm, later said he felt he had been hung out to dry. He lost his BBC career. The man who had commissioned the forgeries was given a clean bill of health and went on to conduct more landmark interviews. And the BBC moved on. Lord Dyson's 2021 report would describe that 1996 investigation as woefully ineffective. That is judicial language, measured, precise, and devastating. What it means, stripped of legal restraint, is that the BBC looked at the evidence, looked at what its own employee had done, and chose to bury it. Tony Hall had the information. He had access to the graphic designer who had made the forgeries. He chose to accept Bashir's denials and close the file. That is not incompetence. That is a decision. For 24 years, nothing changed. The Panorama interview was celebrated. It won awards. It was replayed. It became part of the cultural memory of modern Britain. Bashir went on to a long and successful career, including later stints at major American networks. The BBC treated the interview as a crown jewel in its documentary history. And the forgeries sat in the dark. Then, in November of 2020, Earl Spencer decided he had had enough. He went public. He presented the BBC with a formal dossier of evidence that by this point included testimony, documentation, and Weisler's own account of what he had been asked to create. The BBC's new Director General, Tim Davie, could not ignore it. He commissioned Lord Dyson to conduct an independent judicial inquiry, not an internal review, not a committee of editors, a former Supreme Court justice with full investigative scope. Lord Dyson's report was published on the 20th of May 2021, 127 pages, and it was not ambiguous. Bashir had deceived Earl Spencer to gain access to Princess Diana. The deception was a serious breach of BBC editorial guidelines. The forged bank statements were real. The 1996 inquiry was a cover-up. The BBC had failed Diana at every level. The report noted that, while it could not determine precisely how much the deception had influenced the content of the interview itself, it was clear that the manipulation of Diana's trust and psychological state was central to Bashir obtaining the interview in the first place. The fallout was significant. The BBC returned the BAFTA it had received for the interview. Tim Davie issued a public apology. The corporation paid damages to Patrick Jeffson, Diana's former private secretary, who had been falsely implicated in the deception. The BBC pledged that the interview would never be broadcast again, never be licensed, never be commercially exploited in any form. Matt Weisler, the graphic designer who had been silenced in 1996 and whose career had been destroyed, received a formal apology. And Tony Hall, by then elevated to the House of Lords, resigned from the board of the National Gallery where he had been serving as chair. But the most significant responses came from Diana's sons. And this is the part of the story where the document ceases to be history and becomes something personal, something that cuts through the official language and lands as pure grief. Prince William issued a formal written statement. It was not palace-managed diplomatic language. It was about a son who had lost his mother when he was 15 years old, speaking publicly about what he now understood to have happened to her in the final years of her life. William wrote, and I am paraphrasing because I will not reproduce his exact words in full, but the substance of what he said was this. He stated clearly that it was his view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what his mother said. He said it was his belief that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to his mother's fear, paranoia, and isolation in those final years. And he described that knowledge as bringing him indescribable sadness. Indescribable sadness. That is not a royal communication language. That is a man whose memories of his mother's last 2 years have now been filtered through the understanding that the fear she was living with was artificially constructed by a journalist with a forged piece of paper. Prince Harry's statement, issued separately, was briefer but no less blunt. He said that their mother had lost her life because of this. He said nothing had changed. Harry was 12 years old when Diana died. 12. The boys who last saw their mother alive, who sat in that church in Northampton while Earl Spencer gave the eulogy, have spent the rest of their lives processing what happened to her. And in 2021, they were both being asked to absorb the fact that the man who had shaped the final chapter of their mother's public life had done so through deliberate fraud. Now let us be honest about what the Dyson Report does and does not say, because this is where forensic commentary matters. The report does not say that Martin Bashir caused Diana's death. It does not make that claim. And it would be wrong to present it as if it does. Diana died on the 31st of August, 1997. 21 months after the Panorama broadcast, in a car crash in Paris. The causes of that crash are a separate matter, well documented and extensively examined. Lord Dyson was not investigating the circumstances of her death. What the Dyson Report establishes, as a matter of judicial finding, is this. The BBC's most celebrated and widely watched interview was obtained through deliberate deception. The broadcaster knew this by April 1996 and chose to cover it up. The deception targeted and amplified Diana's psychological vulnerabilities. Her final years, as described by her closest friends and confirmed by her own sons, were marked by a spiral of paranoia and isolation that was, at least in significant part, fueled by what Bashir had constructed. The trust she had placed in Bashir was trust he had manufactured through lies. And for 25 years, the institution responsible for this protected the journalist and buried the evidence. That is the finding. Those are the facts. Every single one of them sourced to a 127-page judicial report, to the BBC's own follow-up Panorama investigation, to testimony from Diana's personal friends, to the statements of her children, and to the formal apology of the BBC's current Director General. What strikes me every time I go back through this story is the precision of the manipulation. Bashir did not just lie to get Diana in a room. He identified the exact architecture of her vulnerabilities, her fear of betrayal, her belief that she was being surveilled, her deep need to trust someone who was not part of the institution, and he built his deception around that architecture. The forged bank statements were not random, they were targeted. They were designed to confirm what Diana already feared, and to present Bashir as the one person standing on her side. That is not the work of a journalist who got carried away chasing a story. That is the work of someone who understood his subject deeply enough to exploit her at precisely the right pressure point. And the BBC, when confronted with the evidence of it, decided that the BAFTA and the ratings and the institutional prestige were worth more than the truth. Diana is gone. She died at 36 years old. She cannot be interviewed about what she now knows, cannot reflect on what she felt in the months after that broadcast, cannot tell us how it felt to discover, if she ever did, that the man she had trusted had manufactured the fear that drove her to trust him. We do not have her voice on this part of the story. We only have the judicial record, and the testimony of the people who were with her, and the words of the two boys she left behind. 23 million people watched that interview. They watched it believing they were seeing a woman finally speaking her truth freely, to a journalist she had chosen, in conditions of her own making. And in the most important respects, they were right. Diana's truth was her truth. Her words were her words. But the door through which those words walked out into the world was built from forged paper. The trust that made the interview possible was constructed from manufactured fear. And the man who built that door spent 25 years being celebrated for it. There is a version of this story that the BBC would prefer. The version where Martin Bashir was a lone rogue, where the institution was deceived just like everyone else, where the 1996 inquiry was merely inadequate rather than deliberately suppressive. Lord Dyson does not give them that version. The report is clear that the BBC's failures were institutional, that the cover-up was active, and that the consequences fell entirely on the people who had trusted the corporation to tell the truth. Diana Spencer trusted the BBC to handle her with integrity. She trusted a journalist who had come to her with forged documents and fear. She trusted that the institution behind him was operating in good faith. Every one of those trusts was misplaced. And the country that watched her interview, that surged the national grid by 1,000 megawatts to see her speak, deserved to know that from the moment Tony Hall closed that file in April 1996, they waited 25 years. The BAFTA sat on the shelf. The interview was replayed and celebrated and studied in journalism schools. And somewhere in the archive, Matt Weisler's forged bank statements sat as the document that started it all, the piece of paper that opened a palace door, that activated a princess's fear, that shaped the last 2 years of her life, and that the BBC decided was not worth the price of exposing. The inquiry is public. The report is available. Every claim in this video is sourced to that document, to the BBC's own subsequent investigation, to testimony from people who were there, and to the formal, on-record statements of the two people who knew Diana Spencer best. This is not speculation. This is not tabloid theory. This is the documented, judicially confirmed truth. And it took a quarter of a century for the country to find out. If this video gave you something to think about, share it. The people who need to hear this are not going to stumble across it by accident. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this story has layers that we have not even touched today, and we will be going deeper. Subscribe to Jenny Exposes for exactly this kind of forensic royal commentary, the kind that does not stop at the headline, that follows the document all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.